If we could take our seats, and we'll go ahead and begin. Marianne, is this working? Yeah. Okay. Father Drew, if we could take our seats. Well, good afternoon. I would like to welcome everyone to today's important conference on the topic of torture, conscience, and the Catholic moral tradition. My name is Walt Grazer, and I chair the Catholic Leadership Council, which is a subunit of the National Religious Coalition Against Torture. And formerly, I served as a policy advisor for human rights and religious freedom at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. This meeting is jointly sponsored by the Catholic Leadership Council, which has been doing, I think, some terrific work over the last year and a half or so, putting together some basic education materials on a Catholic view around the question of torture, which is on the website of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and now putting together more educational materials for adults as part of the Just Faith project. And now this conference is kind of our third major activity. And we're co-sponsoring this with NERCAT, the National Religious Coalition Against Torture, and also with Catholic University of America. And I want to offer just some special thanks as we begin. One to Marianne Cusimano-Love here at Catholic U, who has been our chief kind of colleague here and helping us to get and secure Catholic University. And I also want to thank Father Drew Christensen to my left, and to Jerry Powers, who's not with us, who's at the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame. They were part of the Brain Trust along with Marianne in terms of, and the Catholic Leadership Council in putting together the ideas for the conference. I also want to thank the NERCAT and my colleague Rich Kilmer, who's the Executive Director, who's been just terrific in terms of his support for this project. And finally, I'm very grateful to Heather Rice, who's not in the room, but she has been remarkable in terms of her work at helping us to put all this together and keeping Rich and I on task. Let me just open with a brief kind of to set the tone for the day, if you will. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Have the same regard for one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not be wise in your own estimation. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be concerned for what is noble in the sight of all. If possible on your part, live at peace with all. This verse is from St. Paul, an exhortation to the young Christian community in Rome, and I think it sets the challenge for our work today. Not just to understand how we came to this point in our society where we use a reprehensible method of torture, but also I'm hoping that we can offer a sense of hope and be able to extend a blessing to everyone, and particularly even to enemies. I think this Pauline challenge is a very difficult one, even for the best among us. But I think it's a challenge especially pertinent for the Catholic community. Polls in recent years have shown a disproportionate support among Catholics for torture, and it shows that we have a lot of work ahead of us. Torture is part of the dark side of our human nature. In our genuine efforts to obtain security, using torture betrays our religious and moral foundations, as well as our noble aspirations of democracy and human rights. And it certainly destroys or diminishes human dignity. In this awful business, no one escapes degradation, neither the torture victim, nor their tormentors, nor even us as citizens in whom they act in our name. Pope Benedict XVI has said that prohibition against torture cannot be contravened under any circumstances. And his view was echoed by Bishop Winsky, the former chair of the Committee on International Policy at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, when he said that the nation must not embrace a morality based on an attitude that desperate times called for desperate measures. And he said that in a time of terrorism and great fear, our individual and collective obligations to respect the dignity and human rights, even of our worst enemies, gains added importance. Our nation must treat its prisoners as we would expect our enemies to treat our own military personnel. We certainly are grateful for the signing by President Obama of an executive order on January 22nd halting torture, but we still have a great deal of work ahead of us, and I am personally grateful to all of you for being here. A special welcome to many of the students, our future leaders, and I want to thank, of course, our moderators and panelists for their sharing both generously with their time, but also with their expertise. And so I look forward to this day. They are kind of our guides, and I hope that they will help us look at this question and figure out a way forward as the day wears on. I'm going to ask Linda Gustaitis, who's the president of NEERCAT, to come up just to say a word of welcome. And while she does that, I still want to point out Heather Rice, who's right there, who has done so much to help bring this conference off, and I don't think this would have been possible really without her help. So thank you, Heather. Linda?
Thank you, Walt, and thank you all for being here. This is not a subject that people flock to talk about or to hear about. It takes a bit of courage and determination to come out to discuss a topic like this, and NEERCAT really appreciates your presence here. We also very much appreciate the support of the Catholic Conference of Bishops and the participation of the Catholic Leadership Council in the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. It's been a very strong force in our work. I briefly want to let you know what the National Religious Campaign Against Torture is. It's a fairly new organization. It was founded in January of 2006 by Reverend George Hunsinger, who is a Presbyterian theologian who teaches at Princeton. And he called together national religious leaders to talk about about the issue of torture, because we were learning about what we had been doing as a country since 9/11, starting with, in April of 2004, the release of the pictures of ghosts of Abu Ghraib, the treatment of the prisoners there. As a result of that conference, we ended up creating a national organization of religious organizations, and we now have a membership of over 250 religious organizations, everything from national religious organizations to individual congregations. We also have staff in Washington, D.C. now. We have about 6 to 8 staff people in a Washington office. We've gotten tremendous support from not only religious organizations, but foundations for our work. Our major goal last year was to have the new president, issue on the first day an executive order ending torture. We didn't get the first day, but we got the second day. And it was a terrific success. We worked with other human rights organizations, and it was very much the religious voice that contributed to the achievement of that executive order. And it was a major, major victory for all of us in the fight against torture. Some people think the work was done then when the executive order was issued, and the answer is it's not. One point is we have to get enacted into law the provisions in the executive order, because a new president could come along and issue a different executive order or interpret it in a different way. So this year we have our effort is focused on getting the executive order enacted into law. Our second most important goal is to get a commission of inquiry established, to have this country face the facts of what we did, how many people we did it to, who was involved, what caused this, so that we can learn about the facts in a way that will prevent it from ever happening again. That is the objective of the Commission on Inquiry. And that's a hard fight. You may have been following some of this in the newspaper. There are a lot of people who are supportive of it, but there are a lot of people who want to leave the past in the past and move on. And for us, that is a very dangerous thing to do, because we have to call this very dark period of our history up, present it to ourselves, and address it. So we are asking everybody to join us in the support for the Commission of Inquiry. There's information on this in your packet. We're asking you to sign and to get your friends and religious communities to sign our statement in support of the Commission of Inquiry. We want to build grassroots support across the country for this. The Gallup poll shows that a majority of Americans, maybe a sizable majority, like in the 60% range, actually support an investigation into torture. So we've made a huge leap forward in terms of public consideration of torture. But we need to get Congress to act on this Commission of Inquiry. So that is one of the pieces in your packet, and we hope that you will pay attention to that. You have a fabulous conference to look forward to this afternoon. Some of it's going to be hard going. It's not, as I say, a pleasure to listen to some of the things that we've done, but it's something that is real, and it's something that we have to deal with, particularly as people of faith. So I thank you very, very much for this conference, and we are so happy and privileged to be co-hosting it.
Thank you, Linda. As I said, she's been a big supporter and quite remarkable in her leadership and voice on this issue. Let me ask my colleague, Marianne Kuzmino-Love, to come up and say just a word of welcome for Catholic U, and then we'll begin the conference.
Thanks, Walt. I'll be very brief. I just wanted to thank you all for coming, especially on a rainy day that looks very much like the somber topic we'll be discussing, and a day in Lent that I think also lends itself to the themes. We're here today with the support of the Life Cycle Institute at Catholic University. The director asked me to step up and just say a word or two. He was not able to be here. Will join us later today, Steve Schneck. The Life Cycle Institute is a community of scholars and researchers here who are engaged in the academic analysis of public policy issues that concern Catholic social thought. So everything from war and peace to economic justice issues and pretty much everything in between. And it's obviously part of the mission of the university to be of service to Christian thought and education in the Catholic community, as well as service to the nation and the world. The proceedings today, I know we've got many students here with us and others who may not be able to stay till the very end. The proceedings will be available on the web on both the Life Cycle Institute website as well as the Center for International Social Development, which is our other supporter here at the university. The Center for International Social Development is an interdisciplinary certificate program for students who are interested in social justice issues and you might want to pursue a master's certificate. You can look at the information out there. So that's really all I wanted to say. Welcome. Thank you for coming. And thank you very much for our hosts. We'll also see Dr. Carla Simon and Dr. Fred Ahern, who are director of the Center for International Social Development, will be joining us today. So thank you to them for their kindness. And we look forward to the comments.
Thank you, Marianne. So now we'll begin the conference itself, and I'd like to introduce Father Drew Christensen. Father Drew is a close friend. He's a mentor, and he is a confessor, so he probably has lots of good stories about me, but he can't tell you. He's also currently the editor of America Magazine, Jesuit Magazine, National Magazine, which I read religiously every week and appreciate it. And he was formerly the director of the Office of International Justice and Peace at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. He also has a long academic career and has written on many, many topics in the field of Catholic social ethics, including this question of torture. And Father Drew is going to moderate our first session. Welcome, Father Drew.
I'm grateful to Walt for the invitation to be here and to Marianne for arranging to host the conference here at Catholic University. This opening panel with a number of longtime colleagues and a conversation that has gone on for some time now on this issue is really about the conditions that allow for torture and the conditions that will prevent torture. How is it that people come to let down their guard and think that torture is permissible, and what we're going to do to remedy those dispositions. And in particular, we will look at the conditions that the church can provide in its pastoral teaching and in its pastoral practice to help prevent torture, but also what can be done in military training. There is something I call moral panic, a reality to which Bishop Wensky referred in the quote that Walt gave us, a situation where the world seems turned upside down, and as a result, we lose our moral compass and think that we can do anything that will right the boat and discover later that indeed didn't work. In the case of torture, for the Catholic Church, that began with the fall of Rome in 410, in which Augustine became so alarmed that he began to think about permitting the torture or validating, justifying the torture that the Roman authorities already engaged in. And that became, particularly with respect to the repression of heresy, the doctrine and the practice of the Church for 1,500 years. And only in 2000 was it really finally renounced, when at the Day of Pardon for the Great Jubilee of 2000, Pope John Paul II asked forgiveness for sins committed in persecution of heretics, especially the use of coercion in the repression of heresy, for anti-Semitism, for the Crusades, and for the Inquisition and the use of coercion in the Inquisition. So it wasn't until 2000 until the Church finally put this behind itself, even though it had long before recognized the dignity of the human person and the notion of the freedom of the human person being something that was sacrosanct. But the formal, not only apology, formal confession of sin, and that's what it was a confession of sin with respect to this, only took place within the last decade. So the question is, how do you avoid giving in to a moment of panic and thinking that anything goes morally when the pressure's on? To address that issue, we have Peggy Steinfeld, who's going to look at American society and the kind of conditions that allowed us, and particularly American Catholics, to think that torture might be something that we ought to be done in our name. Peggy?
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I don't think I've ever been at the law school at Catholic University, but it lives in my mind. As the former editor of Commonweal, we would get complaints from time to time because we called it Catholic University of America instead of the Catholic University of America. So I'm delighted to be at the Catholic University of America. And I come to you not as an expert on this subject by any means, but really as an editor and writer and someone who very early in our recent spate of wars became very conscious of what was going on. And this is a kind of report to you about what I have found out over the years. And the first thing we should all recognize is that there is hardly a practice that is more vilified than torture. The legal and moral barriers raised against it are virtually insurmountable. National and international law prohibit it, religious and political leaders condemn it, and so do professional interrogators and law enforcement officials. Even U.S. government officials who signed findings that approved of it condemn torture. They deny, of course, that what they have approved is torture. They also deny that the aggressive interrogation techniques they've approved constitute torture. And yet, since shortly after the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, prisoners were beaten, abused, and tormented. Some of them died. Tim Golden's 2005 New York Times stories gives the details from a U.S. Army criminal investigation of events that occurred in Afghanistan in December 2001. U.S. military personnel were abusing and torturing their prisoners. So some of this might appear to have been, quote, unofficial, that is, the soldiers were acting on their own. It is clear in retrospect that torture practices were given authorization at the highest levels of government early in the War on Terror. The earliest Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel members defending the President's virtually unlimited authority as Commander-in-Chief dates actually from September 11th, 2001. When I was a kid in the last century, I read war comics. Shocking. And it was then about the Korean War. And a prominent feature was the interrogation and torture of American POWs by the Chinese. The Americans, of course, never talked in the comics. I could see that torture was bad. It was evil, though the phrase intrinsic evil hadn't yet appeared in the catechism or in vocabulary tests. I was proud that Americans didn't do things like that. Lesson absorbed. A decade later, the Vietnam War raged. There were plenty of awful things. Napalm, Lieutenant Calley, and atrocities that never made it to the front page. But torture, officially ordered? Not that I've ever heard, and apparently not. Lesson absorbed. So, what an epiphany we've had over the last 8 years. Given all that we now know about U.S. detention interrogation policies, or could know if we had time and stomach for it, we are still left with questions. How did this happen? How did it really happen? How did we let it happen? The 2001 reports from Afghanistan gave the impression of soldiers run amok, untrained in detention or interrogation, undisciplined in their daily routines, and unsupervised by their commanding officers. The October 2003 photos from Abu Ghraib, made public the following spring, 2004, picture scenes from Animal House. They give credence to Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld's flippant judgment of those soldiers as bad apples or worse. Replicated throughout the world and reenacted in Earl Morris's film Standard Operating Procedure, these sadistic images became everyone's idea of what is meant by torture and or aggressive interrogation. They are enumerated in General Antonio Taguba's 2004 report. The more systematic and considered abuse and torture of prisoners that occurred at Guantanamo, Bagram, and secret prisons outside the U.S. are less widely known and far murkier in the minds of most Americans. There are no photos. And until this past weekend, only a few logs of the interrogation have been released or leaked. In addition to the torture, these logs describe humiliation and degradation that can seem worse than physical torture. Descriptions can be found in Philip Sand's book, Torture Team, and Jane Myers' The Dark Side. Mark Danner's 2004 collection contains many of the documents from 2002 that set official torture in place. I have some copies up here of a little bibliography that I made so you wouldn't all have to worry about getting the names and titles right. The leak or release of the report from the International Red Cross this past weekend gives the account of some prisoners about their torture. It clearly indicates that interrogators operated on direct commands from officials in Washington. And you can read that in the April 9th New York Review of Books. We know a lot, but there is still much that is not known. The release by the new administration of Department of Defense, Justice, and CIA memos and reports should expose and clarify some of what we don't know. For example, the contagion theory. Did the abusive practices migrate from Guantanamo or for some other prison to Abu Ghraib? What was the role of the CIA in shaping policy and directing the military? Did the resistance by the FBI to harsh interrogation and torture at Guantanamo have any impact on policy? If not, why not? The role of the Vice President and his staff in these policies is set forth in ample detail by Barton Gellman in his book, The Angler. Why did these policies and other dubious legality and constitutionality meet so little resistance in the rest of the government? What were the sources of these practices, the proximate and the historical ones? Were they left over from the Cold War, kept on ice by the CIA? We need to know more about how the government proceeded in making what was illegal, immoral, and inhuman accepted practice. What were the intellectual and cultural conditions that allowed this to happen? Walt mentioned that a majority of Americans, 63%, say that torture may be justified under some circumstances. 72% of Catholics agree. That was true in 2006, and as far as I can tell, it is still true in 2009, despite the willingness of people to have these matters investigated. Ideas have consequences, and so do cultural narratives and images. And I'd like to deal with each briefly and independently, but as we shall see, I think they are deeply connected. Intellectual conditions. The ticking time bomb scenario, which some of you will recognize as the plot line of 24, the TV show, began its life far more humbly as a philosophical example dealing with dirty hands. That is, the acts of political or military leaders that violate legal or moral norms. In brief, the ticking time bomb scenario is used to illustrate an exception in which torture is said to be justified. According to this scenario, there's a bomb that can explode at any minute, killing thousands of people. And a suspect is in custody who may know where the bomb is. In order to get information about the location of the bomb, the suspect is tortured as part of a quick and dirty technique to find the bomb as soon as possible. Though this scenario rests on a terrorist or terrorist plot, it migrates to other situations where a prisoner or his associates are thought to possess information that would be of use in some future events. An intricate intellectual or legal discussion about ticking time bombs may seem benign enough. And Henry Shue, one of those philosophers, began a 1978 essay entitled Torture with this observation, quote, "Whatever one might have to say about torture, there appears to be moral reasons for not saying it. If practically everyone is opposed to all torture, why bring it up? Start people thinking about it and risk weakening the inhibitions against what is clearly a terrible business. Why indeed bring it up?" But as a good philosopher, Professor Shue certainly did, and wrote a longish argument opposing torture in which he nonetheless acknowledged its metastatic tendencies. That is, it's a slippery slope. And he argues against the ticking time bomb by showing how implausible that plot is. Nonetheless, there has been a very large literature on the subject. In 1999, the Supreme Court of Israel, while recognizing Israel to be under threat from suicide bombers, that is, ticking time bomb, forbade the government and its security services and police to use physical means during the interrogation of suspects suspected of hostile terrorist activities. A strong argument. An investigator who used these means, said the court, is exceeding his authority. His potential criminal liability shall be examined in the context of the necessity defense and may find refuge under the necessity defense's wing. I think we can all spot the loophole here, which many people have walked through. Ticking time bombs raise a necessity defense. I cite this case because in the United States, necessity has become the core of a legal theory proposed by Harvard Law professor Alan Dershowitz. He argues that rather than leaving an interrogator to plead necessity after the fact, legislation should provide legal protection by requiring him or her to get a warrant from a court to carry out the torture. Give them legal cover. Let the judge decide. So we have a lot of talk about torture and a lot of thinking about how to make it work legally. And we see in the Bush administration how these things have come to fruition. I'd like to turn now to the cultural conditions. I'm not talking cause and effect here. I'm just talking ambience and environment that I think fostered a tolerance for torture. There are two aspects to this, popular culture and professional culture. And back to the TV show 24 and the importance of the ticking time bomb. Fordham had a conference last October, and much of what I have to say here is from that conference, and it's on our website, once again on the piece of paper. One of our presenters was David Danzig of Human Rights First, who was working on a campaign to stop torture. And he organized a project to look at connections, if any, between the military and TV shows that featured torture and the ticking time bomb scenarios. He happened to phone a Marine colonel at West Point who was teaching the Laws of War course. Danzig said, and I quote him, I'm calling about Jack Bauer in 24. The colonel replied, "This is the biggest problem I have in my classroom." His students were fans of 24, and its stories, he said, had them convinced that torture worked. The video and a description of Danzig's project is available on their website, and it's about 15 minutes long and well worth your looking at. Danzig cites other connectors between 24 and the military and has 2 or 3 examples, which I will just skip over now, except for the last one, which is from Lieutenant Colonel Diane Beaver, who was the lawyer in charge of ensuring that interrogators at Guantanamo complied with the law, who reports that when the second session of 24 came out, people, that is, the interrogators that she was supervising, got a lot of their ideas from it. Last October, again at our panel, film critic Richard Oliva reminded the audience that the ticking time bomb scenario is a version of The Perils of Pauline. That is, the girl is tied to the train tracks. The locomotive is bearing down on her. Tom Mix on Tony the Wonder Horse races the train, undoes the ropes, and saves her. Ticking time bombs, ticking heroines, generate suspense in the movies and on TV. Oliva also reminded us that vigilantism is a well-worn plotline in U.S. popular culture. The hero acts outside of the law for the greater good of the settlers, sheep herders, townspeople, and the city under threat of terrorists. Here again, the necessity defense. And here again, a movie we all saw and loved, Dirty Harry. An infinite variety of media is at our disposal, movies, TV, video games, internet, and they offer a super-saturated world of suspense, excitement, and violence. Todd Gitlin, another panel member, said, there was a time when a car crash in an elementary, mostly garden variety B-movie, police story got attention. Today you have to have an 8-wheel truck go over, perform cartwheels to get attention. A culture of casual violence has fattened on itself and requires ever more gruesome, ever more arresting, ever more horrific violence to attract attention. Are these shows, video games, movies, absorbing but harmless pastimes, as their producers like to say? And you don't have to watch them if you don't want to. Or are they formative vehicles for shaping attitudes toward violence, and more subtly, I wonder, shaping the idea that the human body is invulnerable? Our hero always pops up from a fatal blow, an exploding car, a fall over the cliff. Bodies cannot be damaged or destroyed. Finally, let me just turn briefly to professional culture. That is, the professions that were involved in these practices: law, psychology, medicine, and the military. Each is subject to the law, of course, and each has its code of ethics or discipline. We see in the accounts of torture and permission for torture examples in which the law and these professional codes were bent or broken. The Office of Legal Counsel in the Bush administration produced the memos that led to legal permission to break the law and violate the Constitution. Lawyers in the Vice President's office and in the Department of Defense built on these memos to give permission to the CIA and to the military to torture. Psychologists worked with interrogators, supported them, and gave them clues to a prisoner's weaknesses and fears. A few psychologists also are said to have reversed engineered the techniques of the SEER program, originally designed to help U.S. military withstand torture. Medical personnel kept prisoners from dying of their abuse and torture so they could return for more. The military at various levels countenanced torture and or implemented the orders made by higher civilian authority. At the same time, I think we have to recognize that opposition to these practices and exposure of them also came particularly from the military and the lawyers. And I know General Taguba will speak to you tonight, and his report is available online. Well worth reading. And then there were the lawyers who began to investigate the incarceration of enemy combatants, to file for habeas corpus, and to petition the Supreme Court. I would say psychologists and medical personnel have not responded as vigorously to the ethical violations of their members, for reasons that I'm not sure about, but they may have to do with a looser code of ethics and a weaker disciplinary oversight, but something worth looking at. So what is to be done and what will be done? The new administration has taken steps to reverse these policies, to rescind the findings of the OLC, and there are proposals afloat, which we have heard about already, to investigate what happened. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission that might offer grants of immunity for testimony, or a criminal investigation by a special prosecutor that could lead to indictments and trials. And I think we have to recognize that doing nothing, though it is not yet a popular idea, may well be what will happen if we let it happen. Much is up in the air, and that is why I think we have to come to grips with what has been done in our names. And by we, I mean we, the American people. It seems to me, as we tackle this, two outcomes are important. First, there has to be a true measure of accountability exacted from those who proposed and countenanced these policies. Lawyers should be disbarred. The military has given dishonorable discharges to some soldiers, retired others, and imprisoned still others. Psychologists and medical personnel should face professional sanctions and, where appropriate, civil or criminal sanctions. Is prison the answer? Is public shaming? I'm not sure, but accountability is important. For there to be a credible future deterrent, the United States government has to punish those who broke the law. That is why the highest officials, and not simply the lowly soldier, should be called to account. The second thing, a sense of revulsion has to be reestablished at practices that the International Red Cross report released this last weekend. I should say leaked. They did not release it. Someone leaked it. Describe as cruel, inhuman, and degrading, that humiliate prisoners in U.S. government custody. And it seems to me it is not just the physical sufferings that shame us, but the abuses, mental, physical, and spiritual, that reduce and obliterate the prisoner's human dignity. This calls for a far-reaching critical look at the messages and modes, both of popular and professional culture, that encouraged and tolerated these practices. And I think this requires all of us to step up. I did want to mention, and it's already been mentioned, that the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, which was organized early in 2006, and I think I once went to a very early meeting, its grassroots efforts have involved many parishes or congregations, synagogues, and temples in the effort to bring home the idea that torture is a moral issue, and to lobby government officials and, if I may say so, our feckless Congress, first to end these practices and then to ensure that they don't happen again. That grassroots effort, as much as official investigations, must help bring home to Americans how intrinsically evil these practices truly are. Thank you.
Thanks, Peggy. Peggy, I failed to mention, is the co-director of the Fordham University Center for Faith and Culture. Religion and Culture, sorry. And she also organized and chaired one of the panels for the conference held at Fordham in October, and was, I think, better informed and of sharper opinions than many on the panel. So I'm grateful she was able to come and join us today, and will be part of the discussions as we go along. Steve Kalecki is Director of the Office of International Justice and Peace for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. He's been involved in elaborating the bishops' pastoral response to the question of torture, and in many other things, especially dear to my heart is his work on the Middle East. But Steve will speak to us now about Catholic social teaching and the pastoral program and the policies of the bishops with respect to torture. Steve?
Actually, my remarks are likely to be a bit narrower in scope. I'm really going to be focusing on Catholic social teaching and the official teaching of the Church regarding torture, which was my original assignment. But in the Q&A, I'd be happy to get into more pastoral response and so forth. The Catholic Church's teaching on torture is seemingly simple, but it's also richly complex. On the one hand, the Church's teaching seems straightforward. Torture is fundamentally incompatible with the dignity of the human person, and its practice is absolutely prohibited in all circumstances. On the other hand, the Church's teaching is as richly complex as we are as human beings, both historically and existentially. This is true of the teaching. The Catholic social teaching on torture has undergone development, and it's matured as humanity itself has matured. And today, the Church's simple prohibition of the practice of torture reflects a rich understanding of the human person and a profound vision of human society. My reflections this afternoon are based on my experience as a practical theologian, not an academic one. Moreover, as one who seeks to apply Catholic social teaching to contemporary issues facing our nation and our world, my perspective is informed by history, but it's much more clearly rooted in reading the signs of the times and addressing the current, present situation. History has much to teach us, but the focus of this talk will be on the current state of Catholic teaching on torture. The Catholic Church has more than a passing acquaintance with torture. Members of the Church have been both victims and perpetrators. The Church looks to the cross of Christ and to the witness of Christian martyrs throughout the centuries, in whose torturous sufferings the Church finds meaning and inspiration. However, at the time of the Inquisition and in many historical situations and circumstances in the past, the leaders of the Church have tolerated, as Father Drew mentioned, and even supported the use of torture to achieve, quote, higher purposes. We are a church of both saints and sinners. One of the great strengths of the Catholic tradition is the Church's ability, under the inspiration of God, to repent of past errors and to seek the fullness of God's truth, a truth we believe was fully revealed in the life, death, and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ, but is only partially grasped by the sons and daughters of the Church in each age. In 1998, the late Pope John Paul II offered a reflection on the Shroud of Turin, that cloth that has the image of a suffering figure of the Christ on it. And he connected the suffering of Christ to the inhumanity of torture. Pope John Paul said, "The imprint left by the tortured body of the crucified one, which attests to the tremendous human capacity for causing pain and death to one's fellow man, stands as an icon of the suffering of the innocent in every age." An icon of the suffering of the innocent in every age, of the countless tragedies that have marked past history, and the dramas that continue to unfold in our world. And then he went on to ask a very piercing question. How can we not recall with dismay and pity those who do not enjoy basic civil rights, the victims of torture and terrorism, the slaves of criminal organizations? Pope Benedict XVI made a similar association of the tragedy of torture with the sufferings of Christ when he visited Lourdes last year. In a homily on that occasion, the Holy Father made a powerful connection between the cross of Christ and those who suffer torture in his name. And I quote, "By his cross we are saved. The instrument of torture, which on Good Friday manifested God's judgment on the world, has become a source of life, pardon, mercy, a sign of reconciliation and peace. For on this cross, Jesus took upon himself the weight of all the sufferings and injustices of our humanity. He bore the humiliation and the discrimination, the torture suffered in many parts of the world by so many of our brothers and sisters." In the teaching of the Church, the suffering of Christ and of the saints, especially the suffering imposed by instruments of torture, testifies to the reality of evil in the world. This testimony is not an acceptance of that evil, but rather a call to overcome it. Because Catholics believe the cross leads to resurrection. Death does not have the final word. The victim on the cross was the ultimate victor, and life triumphed over death, good over evil. But sadly, the followers of Christ have not consistently applied the lessons of the cross throughout the ages. Members of the church, as I said, have not only been victims, they have been perpetrators. In a remarkably candid passage in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the compendium of all the church's teaching, we read, and I quote, "In times past, cruel practices were commonly used by legitimate governments to maintain law and order, often without protest from the pastors of the church, who themselves adopted in their own tribunals the prescriptions of Roman law concerning torture." It's a remarkable passage in a catechism. And it goes on to say, "Regrettable as these facts are, the church always taught the duty of clemency and mercy. She forbade clerics to shed blood. In recent times, it has become evident that these cruel practices were neither necessary for public order nor in conformity with the legitimate rights of the human person. On the contrary, these practices led to ones even more degrading. It is necessary to work for their abolition. We must pray for the victims and their tormentors." End quote. This passage from the Catechism hints at the simple yet complex nature of the Church's teaching on torture. Simple in its current absolute rejection of torture, in its absolute commitment to the abolition of torture, but complex in its own historical record on torture and in how torture is neither necessary for public order nor compatible with the rights of the human person. The basis for the Church's now total rejection of torture is, of course, the teaching on the life and dignity of the human person. The human person is created in the image of God, and in Christ all are offered redemption without exception. In Catholic teaching, human dignity does not come from any human quality or accomplishment. It comes from God. For this reason, the Catechism teaches, in its section on blasphemy, it is also blasphemous to make use of God's name to cover up criminal practices, to reduce people to servitude, to torture persons, or put them to death, end quote. The Catechism later declares, torture which uses physical or moral violence to extract confessions, punish the guilty, frighten opponents, or satisfy hatred is contrary to respect for the human person and for human dignity. In Catholic teaching, torture dishonors the Creator in whose image every person is created, and it disfigures the human person who is always worthy of respect. At its core, this teaching, therefore, is very simple, but the application of this teaching has complex ramifications for human persons and for our society as a whole. In Catholic teaching, there is more than one victim of the act of torture. In the first place, there is, of course, a profound concern for the immediate victim of torture, whose body and mind are assaulted. But the Church is also concerned for the human dignity of the perpetrator of torture, hence the call to prayer for them, because they too are debased by the act of torture. This is why the Catholic Church, the Catechism, calls on Catholics to pray for both victims and tormentors. Echoing the powerful words of Pope John Paul II, the compendium of the social doctrine of the Church states, and I quote, "Christ's disciple refuses every recourse to torture which nothing could justify and in which the dignity of the human person is as much debased in his torturer as in the torturer's victim." In the torturer as in the torturer's victim. To kind of get a sense of where this teaching emerges, we might look more broadly at the teaching of the Second Vatican Council in the early 60s. In a very profound passage the Council Fathers wrote, Whatever is hostile to life itself, such as any kind of homicide, genocide, abortion, euthanasia, or voluntary suicide, whatever violates the integrity of the human person, such as mutilation, physical or mental torture, and attempts to coerce the spirit, these things infect human civilization. They contaminate those who inflict them more than those who suffer the injustice, and they are a negation of the honor due to the Creator. You see, in Catholic moral teaching, torture attacks the human dignity of its direct victims, but it also victimizes the perpetrators and any society that tolerates its practice. In the words of the Second Vatican Council, torture contaminates society. It debases society. This is true because, according to the teaching of the Church, the human person is both sacred and social. Sacred, having human dignity, but also social. What we do to one another, we ultimately do to ourselves because we are social beings whose fates are bound one to the other. A society that tolerates torture weakens the common good of all persons because it undermines respect for human dignity and basic human rights, foundations upon which the common good is built. These rights, the right not to be abused, not to be tortured, should find expression in laws that protect human dignity and prohibit torture and other actions that assault human dignity. For these and other reasons, the Catholic Church supports international humanitarian law. Now, out of respect for the innate dignity of the human person and the common good of all, the Church has come to see torture, in a phrase echoed by Margaret, as an intrinsic evil that can never be justified. Let me talk about that for a minute. The inevitable harm torture does to individuals and to society as a whole allows of no exceptions. Pope Benedict XVI has spoken of the evil of torture on a number of occasions. And just in 2007, he reiterated the teaching of the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church that the prohibition against torture cannot be contravened under any circumstances. No ticking time bombs. To those who would advance arguments for the exceptional use of torture to protect public safety, the Catholic Church now argues that we cannot do something that is intrinsically evil and expect good to come of it. In Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, the statement on political responsibility that the U.S. bishops issued in November 2007 in preparation for the 2008 national elections, the bishops referred to the issue of torture 5 times. They acknowledged that torture is intrinsically evil and can never be justified, and went on to state categorically, and I quote, "The use of torture must be rejected as fundamentally incompatible with the dignity of the human person and ultimately counterproductive in the effort to combat terrorism." Now, it's counterproductive not only because experts tell us that it does not work. It is counterproductive precisely because it undermines the very good that it hopes to achieve, the common good of all. That's why it's intrinsically evil. In his encyclical or teaching letter, The Splendor of Truth, Veritatis Splendor, the late Pope John Paul II indicated that we cannot make moral exceptions and perform intrinsically evil acts, even when our intentions may be good. He goes on to quote the Second Vatican Council's absolute rejection of intrinsically evil acts that infect human civilization and contaminate those who inflict them more than those who suffer injustice. Today, as Peggy pointed out, our American culture is in danger of failing to grasp the insidious nature of intrinsic evil. For example, as we heard, Jack Bauer in the popular television series 24 is presented as an entertaining hero, but his character is no social nor moral hero. His use of torture undermines that which Jack Bauer seeks to preserve and protect, the lives and dignity of ordinary people. The Catholic Church's teaching on torture has developed over the centuries. In a church of both saints and sinners, as I said, of both victims and perpetrators, the Church's social teaching on torture has a special authenticity, a special credibility, and honesty. In the service of the human family, as it seeks the full truth of the human person, the Church, in faithfulness to its Lord, has come to understand and teach with incredible honesty and clarity that the prohibition against torture is absolute. Torture is a moral issue because the act of torture is absolutely incompatible with the dignity of the human person, and the practice of torture wounds the victim, the perpetrator, and the common good of all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Colonel Pat Lang is a veteran of the Defense Intelligence Agency, having worked and headed up the Middle East Division and also Human Intelligence for the Defense Intelligence Agency. And I learned only today in reading this particular version of his bio that he's also retired as the presidential rank of Distinguished Executive from the Federal Service. So Pat's going to talk to us about training the military to be responsible with respect to these questions.
Thank you, Dr. Drew. Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here to talk about this. I was also at this Fordham thing some months ago, so in case we've all had a chance to refine our positions, and I'm glad to talk about this once again. I should tell you a few more things about myself, sort of to establish the fact that maybe I know what I'm talking about here. And I served the United States for 36 years. 2 years in the National Guard as an enlisted man as a child soldier. And it has an evil sound, doesn't it? And then 26 years as a regular Army officer, first in the infantry and then in special forces, the Green Berets, as you call them. And then in military intelligence, where I became a specialist in the Middle East. I was the first professor of Arabic at West Point and a bunch of things like that. And then when I was finally persuaded that I was getting too old for this kind of stuff, I was asked to take a job as the head of the whole Middle East thing in the Defense Intelligence Agency and later Human Intelligence Collection Worldwide. Then finally I decided to go to work for a living, and I retired and went into business with an airborne company in the Middle East that manufactured building materials. I worked at that as a company executive for 10 years, and then I quit at the right time, and I'm having a very good time as a retired person now. And I very much enjoy coming to things like this. But I've done a lot of these different kinds of things. I was in Vietnam several years, and I fought in a lot of other places in special forces that you don't even know that Americans ever fought in, because it wasn't desired that you should. And so I've seen a lot of terrible things, and war, I would have to tell you, is a very bad thing. I always like to check to see who's in the audience, to know who I'm talking to. Now, I know there's a brother officer sitting right up here. Now, how many other people here have ever served in combat in the ground forces? You, I know. And how many people have ever served in the police department in a serious kind of way, other than be a reserve policeman, because your uncle was an alderman or something? And, how many people have served in a national level intelligence organization where you were really up against the real stuff? There were real enemies out there, and you weren't really fooling around. This wasn't just about every year's appropriations. Not too many. Well, that's what I thought. This is good. I prefer it this way. This is sort of tabula rasa. I have to tell you some things that are probably going to be hard to accept, And I'm on record here for a long time now about this torture thing. Some of you might have seen me on 60 Minutes 5 or 6 years ago, in which they pinned me to the wall, and I said that what had happened at Abu Ghraib, these places, if what was said about it was true, it was an absolute disgrace, that should never have happened, and it should be punished severely. And I still think it should be punished severely by punishing the right people. Now, some of the things you have to understand about the context in which this occurs, something like this. And I'm going to talk about the military because I don't want to talk about the CIA. They are off in their own world. They don't have an ethic that I subscribe to or understand. And the Marine Corps is terra incognita for me. So I'm going to talk about the United States Army, which is my world, my village. My family served in the United States Army from 1861 to now. In 1861, there was some sort of event going on that attracted our attention, and so we got involved in this, and they have been ever since. So I know a lot about the culture, the background, the thinking implicit in the way the Army thinks about things as an institution, right? And when you're talking about an institution like this, you're really talking about commissioned officers, really, because enlisted people who, of course, do most of the real fighting, are led by the officers, and the officers set the tone, especially commanders at all levels, from platoon leader to theater commander, of what it is that people should think about things all up and down the line. And everybody takes their cue as to how they should think about their role in life, what their responsibilities are, from the collective attitude of this chain of officers, commissioned officers, you know. So a lot of you probably don't know what that means. Second lieutenants and up, right? It used to be everybody knew that, but the draft's been going so long now that people don't anymore. You know, but in fact, so that's why the thing that Margaret was talking about cadets at West Point is so important. And it isn't just true about West Point. It's true generally about accessions into the military and the Army in this case, from all sources of commissioning of officers, from ROTC, from the officer candidate schools, from direct commissioning of enlisted personnel, all these kinds of things. And it's very important what the officers think about this. Now, I was a professor at West Point once. I don't know how that happened, but it did. But I was there for several years. And I used to talk to cadets all the time about what they thought about things like this. And even then, I was concerned about their attitudes. A lot of people think that officers somehow still represent a kind of archaic social structure that hasn't existed in the United States for many, many years, in fact. Many years. In fact, you know, there's this kind of image that kids go to West Point or they go to some other nice school, you know, because their daddy has a lot of money and there were legacies, and their mothers wear white gloves and hats to tea parties in the afternoon and belong to the junior league. Well, that ain't so, folks, at all. This gentleman over here was an admissions officer at West Point. He can tell you that. In fact, the Army has made a very hard effort for a long time now, to make West Point and the officer corps look like America. Look like America. That it should represent people from all parts of the country and that all strata of society economically, of varying degrees of education and their familial backgrounds, all that kind of stuff. So that when you get people at West Point, places like this, their attitudes represent what the attitudes are out there in society, very much out there in society. Now, as Margaret said, we don't call I call you Margaret. Thank you. As she said, in fact, you know, these kids who are going to be the leaders, who will become captains and majors and lieutenant colonels and Petraeus eventually, you know, they come from a background in which they are exposed to all this rubbish that's in our culture, and it is rubbish, trash. I mean, look around us at what is going on in American society today. Look at the economy. Look at the financial disgrace, right? Look at greed, rapacious greed, completely unconcerned with the welfare of others. In the last 10 years or so, in consulting stuff, I worked for a number of financial intelligence outfits up on Wall Street that advise all these crazy people who have lost all this money. And I used to see these guys all the time, and they were absolutely concerned with nothing whatever except themselves, getting ahead, taking advantage of everybody else, the idea that they should have some sort of social conscience, that they should be concerned about the welfare of others, is absolutely non-existent. And you see it right to this day in this rubbish about all these bonuses they paid out to those idiots in London who wrecked the world financial system, right? And this is universal, right? So the people that are passed into the hands of people like Colonel Solis at West Point, this professor of law, which is what he was, and even me at times in the past, people like us, are these kids, a lot of them come to us with no background that indicates to them that they should have any real concern for anything other than either a kind of machismo loaded nationalism or a great concern for how do I curry favor with the boss to get ahead. You know? And then the responsibility has to be there to do something with them to make them understand that they have a greater calling than that, that what they're going to do in life, if you manage to hang on to them long enough, is they're going to devote their lives to the defense and protection of others, which is the only possible justification for being a soldier. The only possible justification. See? Well, that's a very different kind of attitude from the attitude of let's torture them until they talk, and that Jack Bowers has, or the attitude that you've seen on Wall Street these many years now past, right? It's a very different kind of attitude. Now, so the Army has the problem of trying to transform these people into people who will not allow that kind of thing to happen. Because I'm here to tell you some things about the Army that, since you don't have any real background in this, other than seeing Saving Private Ryan, maybe, or something like this, that you may not know, and that is the fact that the ground forces, especially the ground forces, and not the peripheral people, but the real people who do the core business of the ground forces, their function in life is to kill people and destroy things, right? Their function in life is to kill people and destroy things. That's what we do in the Army and the Marine Corps. That's what we do. We do it in the service of the government of the United States, as people in other armies do it in the service of their governments. That's what we do. This can be summed up nicely in the description of the mission of infantry units, which is to close with and destroy the enemy by fire and maneuver and close combat. To close with and destroy the enemy by fire, maneuver, and close combat. Now, that means that you have to be ready to do that anytime. And your leadership as an officer, all those people in that stack of leaders I was telling you about, they are all dedicated to that. But they know something about what happens in the process of making units that are ready to do that reliably, dependably, well. They know that the great kind of silly idea that you see in the movies all the time, how people are deeply wounded by killing somebody, is in fact nonsense. In fact, the kind of people who are good at being combat soldiers and who serve well at it are people for whom, once you start doing this and you are trained to do it and you are armed and you're under competent leadership, doing it gets easier and easier all the time. And those who have done it know that's true. Those who have done it know that's true. The Army knows that collectively as an institution. They know that when you take a group of people who are suitable for this, and not all people are suitable for this, of course, not at all, but you take a people who are suitable for this, and you train them to do this under your command, what you do is you unleash many of the darkest features of the human soul, at least a lot of the most animal parts of the human soul. Therefore, it is necessary not to enable that in these guys that you have made into these combat units, but to learn to control it and restrict it severely. So the Army is in large part about telling people what they can't do. The Army has this much praised field manual on interrogation of prisoners of war. What that's about really is not telling you how to interrogate them so much as telling you what you are not allowed to do. And what you are not allowed to do are all these bestial, stupid Animal House things that they did at Abu Ghraib, and the really awful, sadistic things that have been done in other places. You're not allowed to do that. The Army doesn't want that done. And for that reason, the Army has never, and I defy you to prove otherwise to me, the Army has never trained anybody to torture anybody. because we know, in fact, that once you start doing that, you unleash things in people that are uncontrollable. Even in the worst of armies, people have always known that if you allow somebody to use your troops that you have under control, for whom you are a leader, to do really unspeakable, beastly things outside the normal realm of mayhem that is combat, right, that is allowed by international law, that in fact, what you do is you start to destroy them as human beings. You destroy their self-respect as what they think of themselves as humans. You destroy their respect for each other. And very quickly, they don't respect you anymore. And you know what? Every time you go into combat, if you're down at the lower end of that stack of leaders, as I was and he was in various period of time, every time you go into combat and you make contact with the enemy, you stand for re-election. Because you taught them to kill, and they are all heavily armed. And they sure as hell better respect you and want to obey you and understand that there are things that you don't allow because you're like their father. You know, that has to be that way. So the Army doesn't teach people to torture. They never would do that. They know far better than that. And throughout the history of the Army, there have always been people who have broken the law, and there have been lots of court-martials because the Army punishes this kind of behavior severely. Severely. I can point to any number of examples in American military history of really spectacular courts-martial over this. So the question arises, how did this wretched thing happen? Well, it happened because once we went into this war, you had all these young people who had no real experience of interrogating anybody. I mean, the Army in peacetime does not fight. It does not engage with the enemy. It trains. So it never gets to interrogate anybody. In DIA, where I was, at the National Intelligence Community, we got to interview a lot of people who had defected from the other side, things like this. There's nothing like that goes on at all. In fact, what you have is a long, drawn-out process of drawing information out of people on the basis of what they want and what you want. That's what you really have. But in this war, these wars which you had people in the Army and Marine Corps who had never really interrogated anybody, but who had been exposed to all this rubbish in the movies and on television, who were encouraged by the sitting administration, in fact, to do whatever it is you had to do, to do whatever it is you have to do to find out what we want. A more amoral and immoral thing to tell these people could hardly be imagined. And who were the people they were telling it to? A lot of these people, like these poor, pathetic characters at Abu Ghraib, so a reserve MP unit from the farthest depths of Appalachia, you know, where everybody was joining the reserves in order to have an additional element in their income, and had a minimal exposure to Army culture to begin with. And then above them, you had reserve officers like this guy Jordan from Virginia, who was in charge of all the interrogators. And above them, you had hyper-ambitious regular officers, like the commander of an MI group from Germany, and a lady general who was the chief intelligence officer of the theater, who sure as hell should have known better, who should have stopped this, but they didn't, in fact. So these things happen. And the issue is, why didn't these officers stop this, right? The officers know what the position of the Army is with regard to this, that there will be no torture, that it's a crime, that this is not allowed. They know that's true. They absolutely know it's true. They didn't stop this because something has gone missing in the culture, both of the upper echelons of our government and in our greater American culture as a whole. Something which doesn't tell you anymore that some things are right and some things are wrong, and that some things shouldn't be done just from the point of view of the Army, because it's absolutely destructive of the organization. That all disappeared. So this brings me to the point of what I was supposed to talk about to begin with anyway, but this is sort of a wind-up here. But in fact, you know, you look out here, now none of you people, you know, have ever had anything to do really with the government, no, except my friend here. And the rest of you, you know, I don't know how many of you have relatives who've served in Iraq or in Afghanistan or one place or another. I don't know what the percentage is, but I've asked this question in a lot of other fora, and usually the percentage is very low. You know, there's a tremendous disengagement has taken place between people who are morally concerned about this, who are concerned about what the teaching of the church is, as Mr. Colicchio was talking about over here, and what is actually going on in the heads of people who have to be out where the rubber meets the road. And in fact, there needs to be a re-engagement. There has to be a concern on the part of the American people to make sure, in fact, that their basic values, if they are still their basic values, or the values of the people of faith across the country, not just Catholics, but Christians in general, and people of all kinds of people in the community of the people of God, that in fact, that those kind of values are in fact really being taught to people and not the wretched values of Wall Street excess and the movies. Those are the things that need to be done, in fact. And that's what you ought to be clamoring for, is to make sure, in fact, that all these places that create officers, that train officers, that educate officers, are teaching them things that teach them real human values and the values, in fact, that you would be proud of. And that's what went wrong here, because this should never have happened. Some major somewhere should have stood up at Abu Ghraib, some lieutenant colonel at Bagram, somebody that said, you are not going to do this, because if you do it, I'm going to charge you under the Uniform Code of Military Justice with the crime which this is. That's what should have happened, and it would have stopped it immediately. But there weren't enough people who had guts enough to do that, or the conviction necessary to do that. And that's our fault, collectively, all of us. And I hope, in fact, that you will go away from here with the intention in your mind to do something about that, whether you, in fact, ever had anything to do with the government or not. Thank you.
We have some about the better part of an hour for discussion. I want to ask the panelists whether they have questions or comments to make to one another before we go to the general audience.
Well, yeah. So all of those military officers had higher authorities they reported to, or higher authorities who issued them orders. Where do you see the connect between the civilian authority here and, not just the people at the Pentagon, but somehow this went up and down some kind of line of command at some point. Maybe not at Abu Ghraib, maybe not initially at Bagram, but at some point there was in place a series of expectations or orders, etc., that was not coming from the top military officers.
Well, orders are orders is a long failed defense, I believe, right? That has not been applicable since the early 50s, I think, in terms of international law. And it isn't applicable in the U.S. military law either. The fact of the matter is that the officers of the United States Army and non-commissioned officers, the same thing, they know what their responsibilities should be. But there has come to be a kind of collective failure of willingness to accept the price of doing the right thing. People have to be willing to accept the price of doing the right thing. You have to be willing to tell somebody, you are not going to do this. It is illegal. It's against our code of behavior, and I will not support it, and I will do something about it. Because you have to understand that sometimes people have the idea that military personnel are like slaves. In fact, that they have no options. But in fact, they do have options. But the exercise of these options through the Uniform Code of Military Justice or through the Inspector General, any number of ways like that, are all conditioned on the fact that they have to be willing to pay the price for doing the right thing. Now, it's only in Walt Disney movies that doing the right thing is frequently rewarded. Doing the right thing has to be viewed as a reward in itself. The fact that that this is what you must do, because in fact it is a matter of your salvation, in religious terms. And if this were more generally permeating the officer corps, then it obviously was in this instance. In fact, that this would not have happened. It would have stopped very quickly. And you mentioned Vietnam. Well, it is true there wasn't a lot of instances of torture in Vietnam. But I have seen instances in Vietnam in which, on the battlefield, troops at the point of capture of some enemy soldier were doing something to him, roughing him up, knocking him around, things like that. Sometimes it was fairly senior person doing it, somebody else come over and say, well, you're not going to do that because I'm going to charge you with a crime. See? And this is not a pleasant thing for a captain to say to a colonel, you know, but it's a perfectly capable thing, and it's perfectly possible for him to charge this man with a crime, which will end his career. And but you have to be willing. You have to have the guts to do it and the willingness to sacrifice yourself. That's what you're there for. You're there to sacrifice yourself.
So when General Myers says he had no idea this was going on, what do we make of that?
Well, I don't know if he had any idea whether or not it was
He
going
did.
on.
He said he didn't.
He said he did not know.
Orders bypassed him. They went around him.
Well, are you asking me if he's a liar?
Well, yeah.
Well, I have no idea whether or not he's a liar. I wasn't in his confidence at that time, but I think that it is a doubtful thing that he did not know what was going on.
Steve, you want to get
Well,
into this?
the comment I just want to make, though, about this is, I think it's a good line of questioning to hold people accountable and to look particularly at leaders, officers and leaders and so forth. But the most telling comments in both of your remarks that grabbed me from a moral perspective is that we, as a society, now, I would say, have a very utilitarian ethic that objectifies people in a way that gives them less sort of moral content. And I think we've weakened the fabric that enables, the fabric of society that enables people to make those courageous decisions, that helps them to even see that a decision needs to be made. And I think that the finger needs to be pointed, but I'm afraid it's also going to kind of boomerang on us, because as a society, we've tolerated in our entertainment, in our societal values, things that lead in the direction that, in fact, we have gone.
Look, I would like nothing better than to see some of these fellows punished, because they violated the code of ethics of my profession, among other things. But in fact, it is much more important, as you say, to recognize the depth of corruption of American society in terms of what it teaches people to think should be their primary motivations, that they should be motivated towards self rather than something else. I mean, what could be worse than a young man who goes to West Point, becomes an officer, gets to be a colonel, he's in command of 4,000 armed men, and he thinks that what they do on the battlefield is all about how that will advance his career, right? If that's the case, then he's going to do whatever it is he thinks will advance his career, and then he's going to cover up whatever they did, right? So the fault here lies in our culture, and I thought, and this business that you point to about the way that these movies and TV programs are corrupting these people even further is I think, very true. Very true.
Vicki, what can we do about the movies, the business schools, the other institutions that have?
You talking to me?
Yes, I'm talking to you.
Yeah, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it?
I don't watch television. I mean, except when my job requires me to. Well, I think the problem, I think there are problems in a number of levels, and I don't think it's just the culture. I mean, I think we had in power in this country at the highest levels ideologues who had a certain notion about how things should work in this country, and whether they were corrupted by the culture or not, I have no idea. But I mean, there's something wrong at the very top. I think one of the problems we have is the question of cause and effect. I mean, when you say we're a utilitarian culture, we like to pretend we're also a scientific culture. And therefore, if you can't prove, which generally most sociologists think you can, that sitting and watching violent television for 5 hours on weekends and 2 hours during the week between the ages of 7 and 17 doesn't have an effect. They can't tell. You can't prove a cause and effect. It's very hard, I think, to convince people who make these shows. It's hard to convince parents. It's hard to convince advertisers. And, of course, I think you get into this business of the kind of, moral crusades to censor and to cut off, which are, at the moment, very unpopular in this country. Maybe they shouldn't be. Maybe they're...
I don't think that you can explain what happened on the basis of neocon politics, I don't think you can explain it that way. Because you could have had some political Hildebrand on the other end of the spectrum, we could have all been Trotskyites or something, right?
And done the same thing, yeah.
And done the same thing.
Right.
But you had to have people who were in the system who would have used the tools that are in the system, that are built into the system to stop this, and they didn't.
Right.
They-
Actually, and they created some tools that actually allowed it at the very highest level. I don't think it's an either or. I think it is a both and though, but I don't want to let all of us off the hook.
I don't think
guess.
any of us should be off the hook. All I'm saying about I said ideological, I did not use the word neocon, because they could have been Trotskyites for all I know, and maybe they are. I mean, for those of us who were around in the end of the 70s, the beginning of the 80s, when all of the Contra stuff was kind of opened up in Central America, and the so-called rules imposed upon the CIA and other, I guess, intelligence agencies, and which seem to have, eaten at people like Rumsfeld and Cheney. The feeling
who never had done anything themselves.
Well, of course not. Right. But who somehow had it in their mind that when you take off the gloves, which was an expression of Mr. Cheney at some point, what it really meant was that we have unfairly bound our fighting forces, including intelligence and military, by not letting them really carry on war the way war is carried on.
Nobody in the armed forces or in the national intelligence organizations were looking to be unbound in this way. I mean, they were perfectly capable of fighting this war against Takfiri jihadism worldwide, without being released into a world with a complete lack of structure, where every idiot could do whatever they wanted. Nobody wanted that, because everybody knows that the penalties down the road for behavior like that are going to be severe, either institutionally or personally in your personal life in some way. You can't do something like this kind of work. And I was in special operations and espionage and all this stuff for a long time. You can't do this kind of work for a long period of time without having it affect you personally, unless you live by a strict code of what is right and what is wrong, and stay inside those boundaries. And when you take those fences down, then you unleash all this stuff, and what happened is what happens, in fact.
I think at this point, I'm going to open it up to the audience. Back here.
I'd like to address, I think, the three panelists. Some of you have referred to the complexity, is it a cultural problem, is it an institutional problem? And I'd like to suggest perhaps it's a more deeply institutional problem than we're willing to admit in all of our sectors, be it the church, be it the military, be it the government. What I'd like to bring out in terms of argument in defense of that is recently the International Commission of Jurists came out with a very critical report on the war on terror, saying that since 2001, the war on terror categorically or institutionally undermines international humanitarian law and human rights. And I wonder if that does not require some kind of institutional and societal change within the military, within the government, within National Security Council and strategy, and even within the church, perhaps for our timidity or for our silence during the war and during the torture. And if it does not require also a public apology from our government, from our military, and from our church for that complicity or for that silence.
I'd like to just, if I could, take the last piece of that for a moment. Silence. I've actually involved with some email exchanges over the issue of silence. There are very few institutions in American society that have spoken out as frequently and as clearly on the issue of torture than religious institutions. That's actually a record I'm very proud of. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has sent repeated letters to Congress on this issue, done press releases. We created a curriculum on torture that we've distributed to parishes. I mean, it's been an extraordinary level of activity and public attention to the issue by at least that one institution, and it's echoed in many other religious traditions within the United States. I think if I would fault us at all, it was the failure to recognize it soon enough. That it really wasn't until Abu Ghraib became very public that we understood. We heard sort of rumors of it, but did not understand the depth of what was happening. And I think it's no accident that when Benedict XVI came to the United States, on the lawn of the White House, he talked about the importance of the United Nations and international humanitarian law. If you look at that speech, it's a very interesting speech. And then he goes on to the United Nations to give a whole speech centered around the importance of international humanitarian law. So I would just mention those things. But your other point about that this goes very deep, I think that's very true. And it's complex and simple at the same time. It's simple in that it is clearly wrong, it is clearly counterproductive, it has undermined the, quote, war on terror. I don't like to use that phrase because it's really not a war. A war, you line up armies, and you send... It really, to get at the issue of terror, requires all kinds of other things. I know Mary Ann Cusimano-Love could talk to us a long time about how the tools to get at the issue of terror and terrorist acts are entirely different than what we might employ in a war. And I think part of the problem is we've placed the military on a mission that is not exactly its mission. It has parts of that mission, but not entirely.
Well, you got to be careful. You don't just play endlessly with semantics here. I mean, is this a war? Is it not a war? I mean, the fact of the matter is that the response to this kind of a threat from abroad it has to be a kind of multi-spectrum application of a variety of governmental tools. I mean, is that a war? If you want to call it a war, go ahead. The Bush people wanted to call it a war because that kind of sanctified the effort, what they were doing. But the fact of the matter is that the things that happened under the jurisdiction of the military, the Army, there are already all kinds of laws on the books, and policies and directives and all kinds of things, and long-standing traditions that should have stopped this, and they did not. In fact, they did not do that. Now, a lot of you were in your youth, were exposed to all kinds of stuff about how awful we were in Vietnam. Well, let me tell you something. It was a terrible war. I mean, yes, it went on and it went on forever, and there was a lot of fighting all the time. Much bigger fighting than anything in these wars. And in fact, this kind of stuff didn't happen because there's something missing now in the inputs into men's and women's souls who should have drawn back and stood up against this kind of evil. There's something missing that wasn't as missing then.
I think as part of the accountability, we really do need to have a commission, a broadly based commission that will look at American society.
Yeah,
I think the Justice Department will do something. The Congress will be very slow to do anything. We haven't mentioned the Congress, but the Congress is very much implicated, and its failures are part of this. But I think there needs to be a broad, as we said in America, number of editorials, including one 2 weeks ago that has received about 80%, maybe 90% negative response. And whatever the other levels, there needs to be a general national commission that not only look at truth, be a truth commission, but look how we move beyond this as a people and as an array of institutions. Linda?
Can I just give a point of information to Colonel Lang, and that is...
You're going to give me one, or are you asking for one?
I wasn't a question.
Go into
This is a
reception
point of
mode.
information. And I know you already know the first part of it, which is that there's civilian control of the military.
Yes, I know.
So, okay.
That doesn't mean that you have to do what they say.
No, well...
No, that doesn't mean
Let
that.
me just
It doesn't
finish
mean
my
that.
point, which is the Senate Armed Services Committee did an extensive
Yeah.
investigation into what the military did with respect to torture, not what the CIA did because they didn't have jurisdiction over that.
Uh-huh.
But they did look at what the military did with respect to torture. And I recommend to everybody when they go to the website, they've only released the executive summary, but it is a very detailed, very clear explanation of how the approval of torture came from the very top of Rumsfeld
Yeah.
and through the, well, I'm just saying,
It
to
rolled down the chain of
Guantanamo, it
command.
migrated to Bagram in
Yeah.
Afghanistan, and it came to Abu Ghraib in Iraq. And it's not gray, really. It's
Yeah, but
pretty stark and clear.
You're making my point. You're
Well, I'll
making
tell
my
you,
point.
but if you relate that to the civilian control.
No. The
It's very
civilians,
hard for
civilians,
people to
no.
say they're
I don't accept that at all.
Okay.
I don't accept that for 1 minute. Do I accept that? Nobody can order you to do something illegal. Isn't that right?
That's absolutely right.
Nobody can order you to do something illegal.
That's the very reason why the White House went to the Justice Department to get the authority to violate the Constitution and overturn the laws and say that we are exempt from all that.
I don't care about
because
that.
we are under unusual
Every
circumstances.
officer in the chain of command involved in executing these orders should have known from the depths of his guts, everything he ever knew, and everything it says in the Uniform Code of Military Justice, that this was wrong, and he should have said no. And they didn't.
Well, I certainly agree with that. I just want to make the point that,
Well, don't tell me it was hard.
no, because
I
you're
understand
saying
it's
that it was
hard.
only the individuals. I think you're ignoring that it really was also.
Madam, I spent my whole life in this institution and was a pretty senior person in the government, in fact, you know. And I understand fully how hard it is to tell the boss no. That's what you're there for.
What again is the website?
It's the Senate Armed Services.
Armed
So
Services,
it's
okay.
www.senatearmedservices.gov. And look, it's an executive, they're trying to release the whole report. It's classified right now, but the executive summary is very clear.
Back in the corner there?
Yeah, I'm Andy Dixon. I like so much of what was said today, the ambiance and the doctrine and the ethical issues. Thanks a lot. I wanted to say, special thanks for bringing in the economic crisis, because every day today you read the newspaper or you listen to the news and you're just shaking your head saying, where is the difference between right and wrong get lost? And torture and the economic crisis are two great issues right now, I think, that demonstrate that we just somehow in this culture there, people actually don't know the difference between right and wrong. And I don't know where one learns this if you haven't learned it at home. The big question isn't just where you learn it, but how is it taught? How is it learned? I was the principal writer of the curriculum that Steve referred to on torture, and I just wanted to relate this little tiny story, because last June, after it was completed, I got a call from this radio station, Catholic radio station in the Midwest, wanted to interview two of us about the curriculum. And it was a very frustrating experience, because I had to rush home from a long ways away and barely made it, but did arrive. And during this interview, I kept struggling to bring in the larger picture and show that torture as a no fits into a great yes, a very positive body of teaching on the part of the church. And he wasn't interested. All he wanted to know was, can you ever torture someone? Does the Catholic Church think you can never torture anyone? And finally, I had to give up. And I say, well, no. If that's all you want to know, that's a no. But the reason I'm saying this is because it has to do with how you teach ethics. I don't know how, you can't just tell people that things are wrong. You can't just say to somebody who believes that torture is okay because of the ticking time bomb, that no, the church says no, because they won't accept that. So the question is, how do you teach ethics in this context? How do you, what I tried to do was to show that the no is a reflection of a very large body of extremely positive teaching on the virtue of hope, on the gospel of enemy, and the human dignity, as Keith said, and so forth. Anyway, I just think we are lacking in ethical sense in the country now. The question is, what do you do about it? And more than what do you do about it, how do you do it?
And we can go back to the comic books from the Korean War, maybe. I mean, I think it's interesting.
I read those too.
Yeah. Didn't we all? Well, all of us of a certain age. Because in some sense that was the popular culture of its day, and it was pretty clear about what was virtuous behavior and what was not. And I think that, I mean, whether there are those kind of comics now or not, but it's perfectly clear that in the popular culture, what is virtuous and what is not is pretty attenuated. But, I mean, I think it's even worse than that. And I just, for some reason, this popped into my head watching our congressman tell Mr. Liddy yesterday how enraged they are by all of this, as if they are not responsible for part of it. But to remember Mr. Mukasey's hearing to become Attorney General under Bush, saying he did not know whether waterboarding is torture. He should have been laughed out of that room. Those senators should have absolutely, I don't know.
Rejected him.
Well, yes, rejected, but they should have done more. They should have laughed at that. I mean, that is ridiculous.
There are a lot of people around who've been waterboarded. I've been waterboarded in training. You know, I could have told him in a heartbeat it's torture. There's even that crazy guy Hitchens who, the English fellow,
James
you know, they waterboarded him once, and there wasn't a slight doubt in his mind afterwards that this was torture. You know. Yeah.
Christopher.
It's
George
just a sad
Lopez.
thing that's his name.
Two quick points. One, I think this debate about right and wrong may miss something which is characteristic of at least the last decade, is that when you make cases about right and wrong, somebody asks, well, who's right and who's wrong? Not who is, but what's the ownership of that? What's the to be gained beyond that? And a belief that right and wrong is in fact, it can be segmented or deconstructed. And I don't think we've dealt well with that. That was not my
That reminds me of a remark an English professor of mine made when I was an undergraduate once, you know, and this guy said that an epic poem could not be written in America from our time forward because we no longer had enough shared values, you know, and that's really interesting.
Yeah. So I guess I'm making part of the point that it may be even worse than we think, because it's not that there's a lot of folks who don't know the difference between right and wrong. There are people who believe that right and wrong is in fact a constructed phenomenon that only benefits those who are making those particular arguments. And that's a different kind of challenge than we've had before.
But that's not your main point. The main point is,
I think we haven't accented in a sense, two different frameworks that Peggy and Patrick have talked about. I see Peggy longing for us establishing the causal factors that lead people to engage, approve, and sanction torture. And I see Patrick saying, what is it that has the restraints that are built in to people in the systems, have those restraints fall away? Those are two very different frameworks.
Yeah, they are. See,
for understanding what it is.
I would compliment it.
I don't think we've ever done a good job.
I would say that you all, right, should support us in the military in the idea of building a system of values, in fact, that will cause people to resist illegal and immoral orders, which is a fine line, right? Because a lot of times you don't want to do things because it's going to be really tough, you know. But I mean, there has to be a point at which you say, I'm just sorry, I'm just not going to do this, you know. And that has slipped away somehow. That's slipped away. That's bad.
yes, back there. I'm to the side, your side there. The gentleman has his hand up. Sorry. Picking up.
One of my heroes is Father Gaspar Garcia Laviana, who attempted to fight for the liberation of his country and was killed. When he left his parish to go fight for his country, he said he believed that the people needed more than the consolation of words, the consolation of action. I should like to invite the panel and all you represent, each person you represent, and all persons you know, to join this organization of torture survivors at the White House, June 27th, to submit yourselves for arrest in the name of right and in opposition to torture.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for the invitation.
And I would like to also extend that invitation wanted to talk about a different curriculum. We were talking about the curriculum of the Conference of Bishops. And I'd like to propose that the Army also has a curriculum at the Army School of the Americas, in which it has used for years and years and years to teach Latin American dictators how to torture.
Actually, you are absolutely wrong.
And I know because it's been changed, it doesn't exist anymore. It's the WISC.
Hey, I was there in the 60s. I lived at Fort Gulick in the 60s. I know exactly what was in this thing, and that's not true.
Why don't you finish, please? Sure, go ahead.
My point is that that this is a very complicated issue, that we can talk about right and wrong, and we can talk about the top of things, and we can talk about the fact that all of a sudden, in the 8 years that have passed, what has been uncovered so that people can see it now, because the people in power were suddenly encouraging that torture would be acceptable, has also been the dark underside of what our government has been doing for years. And I think one of the things we have to be concerned about is trying to look at that and look at our own history as the American people.
Well, I won't repeat my point. You're just wrong about the book in the School of the Americas. I was there. I know it's not true. So, you can believe me or not, I don't care.
Well, trying to listen to the discussion here, I'm trying to, it's probably a both a Catholic, but whether this is primarily a question of public policy or I would call a question of conscience. You know, for example, so if the military has, let's say, certain things in place and this was a violation of that, that seems to be one, certainly a question of conscience. But looking at like the CIA or others and what the White House did, the question for me becomes, is this really primarily a problem of policy or is it primarily a problem of conscience that we're struggling with here?
And I think your answer is yes. I mean, it clearly is both. And I imagine that they have influenced one the other in both directions.
I think it's a problem of an area that moves between the two, which is character. People can have conscience, not the character to act on the conscience. The military tries to develop characters who will act on conscience, and the JAG officers in particular distinguished themselves in their opposition to torture. They knew what was involved. Other people did not. I think the Congress particularly showed lack of backbone on this issue. And our political culture, unlike the days of the Watergate hearings and all that, have lost that kind of culture, and we've lost the checks and balances, but primarily because everything's become a matter of political calculation. So character, I think, is the bigger question. Yes, over here.
I have a question concerning the efficacy of torture, and I think it probably should be directed towards Ms. Steinberg and Colonel Lang. My question, I think, could be distilled down to this point, and that is, if torture is ineffective, why do people do it? And I say that out of the context of when I went to the Command and General Staff School, we studied the Battle of Algiers. And in that example, torture was found to be both ineffective and effective. And I just wanted to get your sense for why do people torture if it's ineffective, and if in fact there are examples when it is effective.
I'd like to hear about an example where it's effective.
Well, it was effective in that instance.
Well,
The French had specific cases where they were able to identify bombers who were going to attack certain places. So they considered that effective, that they were able to get that information.
Yes, but in fact, it was what they did. It was so destructive of French goals with regard to their overseas possessions that, in fact, it was, in a large sense, completely ineffective.
Short-term effect.
Yeah, very short-term.
Right. And that's why it's, from a moral standpoint, it's the wrong question. From a moral standpoint, because long-term you always lose when you employ something that destroys the human spirit of the individual conducting it, destroys the social fabric of a nation or a society. And I think it's precisely what, as we had the question earlier about the war on terror, what has done more to undermine the war on terror than the images of Abu Ghraib? Very few things. I mean,
I'm not trying to...
Right, I understand. Well, I'm not saying that you are, I'm just,
Why do people do it if in fact that knowledge is out there?
In the instance of the French in Algiers, right, we have the testimony of Paul Oseres, the officer in charge of this project, right? He wrote a book called The Battle of the Kasbah, for which he was stripped of his rank in the French army. His Légion d'honneur was taken away from him, and he's lucky he's still alive, in fact, you know. But in fact, the burden of the guilt of what they did to some of these guys, which is reproduced quite well in the movie The Battle of Algiers, in fact, it was such that, in fact, it destroyed him as a human being, and he's still in that kind of condition. You know, now this may have had some momentary effect on what they were doing in the city of Algiers, but to think that it was effective in any kind of way in advancing the French goal of suppressing the FLN was just foolish.
During all of these years, there have appeared from time to time articles written by or interviews with people who are professional interrogators. And one of the most interesting ones I ever read was written by Mark Bowden. It's in the Atlantic, and it is an interview with a man who headed Israeli intelligence.
Shin Bet.
You've heard this guy.
Yeah, it's a Shin Bet.
Well, I mean, whether or not he ever tortured, the system that he described for interrogating the Palestinians in his prison certainly gave you the sense of the kind of intelligence. He knew what kind of intelligence he wanted. He knew his prisoners well enough, I guess, to get at least some intelligence. And it was not that they're in prison, well, we'll set that aside for a minute. But it was neither brutal. What it really was deceptive. I mean, deception was his tool. Now, I don't know that that's against international law or not.
Not at all.
no, it's not.
But it's perfectly clear that if you are a good interrogator, you are smart, you know the language of the people you're interrogating, you've got some sense of their culture. And I would guess, just to answer the question, why do people torture? I think because they are none of those things, and they just believe that utter brutality will produce something. And they won't even know if it's any good because they won't know whether it fits into any piece of anything that would prove to be a piece of, quote, intelligence.
Michelle Steinberg from EIR News Service. I have a two-part question. One, the President Obama, just recently had some documents released from the Office of Legal Counsel that were these legal opinions justifying waterboarding and other practices, and also dealing with rendition. We're at a law school here. I was at the Fordham event in the audience, and that was also a law school. What is the moral culpability of somebody like John Yoo or any other Justice Department official who rewrites law? You don't change the constitutionality of something with an email memo, in my view. But yet this was the justification for the President and Vice President of the United States. What is the moral culpability of lawyers who do that, and what should be done? There must be some kind of canon of law, like what Colonel Lang's talking about in terms of the military, I hope. Secondly, the question of renditions. I mentioned Israel. They're famous for being depicted or accused of torture, but also rendering people to countries which torture. Maybe some of the panelists will also talk about whether that is alien to Islamic or Jewish cultures, and why did the United States, and still, I'm told, still has not completely outlawed renditions going that route?
Steve? I'll just talk a little bit about rendition. Of course, rendition itself is morally neutral, I think, in most traditions. And the reason is because you could actually use it for a good purpose. That is, somebody is trying to escape criminal prosecution, goes to a third-party country that can't actually deport them. So then you go there, get them to a country where they can be held accountable for that which they have done elsewhere. But rendition for the purposes of torture. You mentioned Islamic law. I have been together on other panels with members of Muslims, and they will tell you that it's incompatible with the teaching of the Quran to torture. I think
of Sharia law.
Sharia law.
Yes, there's a lot more involved there than the Quran.
Right. No, their whole body and tradition that flows from that. And then also, I think I would imagine my rabbi friends would agree that it's not compatible with, since the Jewish tradition shares the same belief in the dignity of the human person created in the image of God. I can't believe that there would be a moral justification that anyone would raise for torture. So I would think that. The other question, though, is about the lawyer, and that one I think is really important. I think Peggy hit that one there. That each profession needs to has its own code of ethics, has its own professional standards. And you don't get to write a legal opinion just because you're clever and you can do it. I mean, it does have to measure up to the professional standards that your profession is dedicated to. And it would seem to me that not only could you be held legally accountable, and you're certainly morally accountable, but professionally accountable for fraudulent use of sources and materials that doesn't authentically interpret the law and appropriately guide people in their decision making.
Well, the current Office of Legal Counsel is looking at those previous opinions to see whether a threshold has gone below by John Yoo and others that would allow them to be charged with kind of negligence.
Well, I will offer it as my unqualified opinion that rendition should end, that there should be no more rendition. Should not have been, because you lose all control over what is done in your name. And this is just an evasion of responsibility and an attempt to evade American law and tradition. And that's what it was, very simply. But in fact, to the question of the ability of military personnel to resist orders from above, I mean, I do not accept the idea that a presidential, an executive order signed by President Bush and drafted by John Yoo should have caused all these officers all the way down the line to have accept practices which they should have clearly known were wrong. This is a point at which they took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, and they should have known better. And if they didn't know better, it's because your system has failed to teach them. The system you pay for.
There was an interesting article in the Chronicle of Higher Education last week about John Yoo. And I think it's important to remember that John Yoo was not alone in the Office of Legal Counsel writing these opinions, although he has become the figurehead of this kind of thinking. And partly what was interesting was in the article was, how should this man be punished? And because it was in the Chronicle of Higher Education, it was attending to the suggestion that his tenure should be lifted at Stanford, where he is in the law school. And there was a big debate among lawyers whether that, and in the academic world, whether he has violated the tenure rule, and or whether he should simply be disbarred for writing bad legal opinions. And so I presume this conversation will go on for a while. And I think it's important for people in the legal profession, there must be some of you or want to be legal profession, to think about exactly what the law should do about, as a profession should do about this. I actually also think the psychologists and medical people have gotten off with nothing. And I think it's because those professions in some ways are different. And they have different, they have different disciplinary methods. Medical societies tend to be statewide societies and not national societies. And the disciplinary things go on in the states, not at a national level. But I do think that these events really ought to give people pause about how they maintain the kind of standards they expect in their professions.
Gene Stokin?
I'd like to switch it to talk about action, and particularly because this is a Catholic conference sponsored by a Catholic institution here, how to harness all of that into what are some next steps we could take. I really applaud Catholic University of America for hosting the board in Stanford. Drew, what you just said about the Truth Commission and beyond the prosecution, I know you're interested in work in America, but how do we take it the next steps? We heard one invitation from the Torture Survivors Organization to join them on June 26th, 27th for that. And there's a number of torture survivors in the group here today listening. I hope that they would feel comfortable, create some space, where we talk about the moral voice in terms of the faith community, the moral voice to which they speak might help them, right, where we can take next steps. But more specifically on the Truth Commission. Truth Commission and then beyond on the prosecution, like what can our Catholic institutions do as the next step? For example, the Bishops' Conference had raised with faithful citizenship the number of times, will they help to advocate for a Truth Commission? And any of the institutions, educational ones, how do we raise up the decibel levels, more conferences, more op-eds? What can we do to take the next step?
I'll at least address part of that if I could, since you mentioned the Bishop Conference in particular. The two actions that I would recommend to the Bishops Conference with the most emphasis behind are actually 4 and 5 on the 5 goals to end torture list. 4 is codifying within U.S. law what is in fact present in the executive order, with whatever features are needed to ensure that it's not simply by the stroke of an executive pen, but rather by the law of the United States absolutely clarifying that the United States, and I think that would send a, especially if it were to pass with wide bipartisan support in the Congress, this would send a public message to the world that we have gotten our act together as a nation and we have codified our rejection of torture. I personally think that's the most powerful public action that can be taken, and I think that is the most doable of the public sort of actions that public officials can do, and I'll comment on that a little bit more in a minute. The 5th point is about increasing the number of people in the U.S. who believe that torture is always wrong. I mean, it's stunning to me that over 60% of the U.S. population, or around 60%, think, you know, under some circumstances, torture is an okay thing to do. That's a stunning failure. I think one of the things we have to acknowledge is that there are new teachers within this culture that are at times more powerful than the parent as teacher, than the church as teacher, than the school as teacher. And so as a culture, in addition to as church and as parents and as schools, that we need to teach values and instill them in youth and so forth, we have got to shift the culture on this question in some significant ways as well, because there are new teachers within the culture that are very powerful, that have supported an ethic that you have the vast majority of the American people supporting torture under certain circumstances. Now, we have a curriculum that we've produced. There will be other versions of that curriculum that will be used within the Catholic community, but this is going to take a concerted effort not only of the church but of other institutions, and this event is, of course, one piece of that kind of a strategy. But I think those would be the two that I would put, personally, I would recommend, I think, give you the most impact on the culture. I'll just comment briefly on the Independent Commission of Inquiry. It would be a good thing for the United States to take a look at itself and to say, what have we done? What was wrong about that? What did we really do to know what happened? I am not sure the country's ready to do that yet. These events are very fresh still in the minds of many Americans. And I would have to study the example of South Africa and other places to see at one point is a culture ready to really do that kind of introspection and to really take it on and to learn from it and to move forward. And I don't know that what else we're dealing with at the moment. So anyway, if you were asking for my own view, is we've got to codify this. That would allow the U.S. to be on record, codify what's in the executive order and other facets of it. And we've got to begin a much more concerted education effort. Because something is wrong. And I would personally not make it just a narrow effort on torture. think for the Catholic Church, it'll be a whole effort on the life and dignity of the human person. We've got to teach that in every way, from the beginning of life to its very final moments, that there has to be absolute respect for the dignity of the human person. And I think that will strengthen us by having us be consistent in the defense of human life, of unborn children, of people who suffer torture, of people who are in crushing poverty, and so on and so forth. We need to be absolutely consistent in our defense of human life.
Yeah, I would really support that. I mean, if it is not the business of the church and its institutions to teach morality, to change the narrative as it now is in American culture, then what is the church's business, in fact? And all the other churches in the United States. I mean, this is the absolute truth.
Well, let me agree with them, but also say something that I'm sure you are all, or at least all the Catholics in the room are conscious of. We are a divided church. And I think each one of us, or each in our parishes, or whatever our local connections are, can do what we do. But if we look back at 2004, and the issues that the bishops, or some bishops, chose to emphasize, you would never know that torture was an issue that Catholics really had to stand up to. And I think we could say the same thing about the last election. And damn it, I bet you're going to be able to say that about the next one. And I really think, I don't know what to do about the bishops. I mean, many of those that are not implicated in this sit in their diocese with their lips sealed, and the rest of them establish the position of the Catholic Church, which is that there is only one issue that counts in this society, and I agree that it counts. I absolutely agree that it counts, but it is not the only issue. And you will never get the Catholic Church operating as one until the bishops give up the idea that there is only one issue of human dignity that is eroding our society.
The only thing I would have to add is that I don't think that's the position of the vast majority of bishops in the United States. And
the vast majority sit there saying nothing.
On a vote of 250 some odd to like 2,
right,
they passed Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship.
Right.
The document within which torture is specifically mentioned 5 times. The fact that some elements of our society emphasize one issue and they use isolated quotes from certain bishops to justify that position. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the bishops of the United States spoke with one voice, with an incredible vote, for a document that was excellent in its teaching and in its scope and in its attention to the detail and essential nature of each and every issue.
It's a great document which I would say almost no bishop defended or touched upon during the appropriate times.
Let me just say that
I think documents are great. I think documents are great. Words are great. I'm a word, that's what I do, words. But I understand it's not enough.
Let me just address the issue of the independent commission. Okay. And that is to say that I think that the form of action that will have the most effect in the short term is an independent commission. You can't expect Congress to act. It hasn't had the backbone on the war. It hasn't had the backbone on this issue. And the executive is too tied up in the economic issues to make the break. But we're not a society that's been divided by a civil war. We are a divided society, but we're not a society divided by a civil war. And a commission that crosses the lines and professions and sectors of society, I think, could do a lot to open up this issue and lay out a plan for the future.
Could I just ask you, Drew, about one issue? Obviously, if this is not a governmental commission, there can be no grants of immunity. But it does raise the question, which has been raised, if there is a government or ladies commission, or what do you think about grants of immunity?
I think you should give them to all at the highest personnel. People at cabinet level and above should not be given immunity. Maybe, I mean, the people ultimately responsible ought to be ultimately liable. But other people that are low on the lines, you could give to, it should be selected, but, they shouldn't be handing them out left and right just for the sake of getting a little bit more information. But yeah, you ought to give it out for people at the highest level. And we shouldn't be in a situation where the foot soldiers are the ones that do time, and the commanders, the top commanders, do not.
Actually, they got promoted.
Yeah. Let's see. Gene mentioned that there are some victims here. And I want, if you'd like to make a comment, I'd welcome you to do that. Or if you want to indicate a space where you might come together with other folks at intermissions or at dinner time, let us know. Okay. So, survivors? Back in that corner? All of survivors. Do you want to say something now? You want to indicate someplace where we...
I'm from the Social Abolition Survivor Support Coalition. My name is Justin. I come from Ethiopia. I'm the sixth director of the FAST International. FAST is the only organization founded by survivors. Sister Diana Ortiz, a survivor of Cuban American. And we both work one way or the other, supporting the Catholic missions back in Ethiopia. For example, in my part, I was an external auditor auditing the Disaster Prevention and Preparedness Commission, which is a non-governmental organization to support food in remote parts of Ethiopia. That is, the fund was transferred from here, from the Catholic service. I was auditing that organization and mentioning $7 million was allocated for development services, rather that money went to the people who are corrupt and the people, the government appointed people. That I disclosed in the report. That was I was taken to prison and tortured. I mean, I haven't seen anything by the Catholic groups here or other countries to raise voice to protect people out there in Africa or in the Middle East. And there is, she's a Catholic sister. She was tortured in El Salvador, protecting the Catholic family members. I mean, all these are, as you say, is a power. The power are, I mean, powerful people embracing the others. My sister, she's from Uganda. She was tortured, protecting two people. Every one of us here who are survivors of torture, we are here because the United States supported countries who are torturing. There is no mechanism to stop the taxpayers' money to countries who are violating the human rights, who are violating, who are torturing people like me and other friends of mine. So we are here. Let's go to the Catholic University of America. Here our office is. We have 655 survivors of torture from 61 different countries, you name it. So we are here every year for the last 11 years. We are here in the Catholic University of America dormitory. We go out in front of the White House protesting for the last 11 years during the Survivors Week, which we call it June 23 after June 29. June 26 is the United Nations Day in support of survivors of torture and victims of torture. So we are working very hard, but we need your voice to support us so that to stop this evil act of what is being done for others, like me and others. So I have an invitation for each one of you, and you all are invited to join us this year, our 12th year, the 24-hour vigil in front of the White House, National Park. Once and for the last, we are already invited President Obama to join us. I met him in person years ago to tell him that what happened to my country and others. I'm not coming here. I was tortured by the U.S. military by U.S. people. But I was tortured because my country government was supposed to $4 billion. The Ethiopian government received from the Bush administration. That has to stop. So we need your voice so that to see. This is not my report. If you can refer State Department's report, we have 138 nations globally torturing their own citizens.
So I invite you to come and join us and to raise your voices, and support us. We need your support. Our website is www.tassc.org. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Will you be handing out those invitations or leave some on the registration table as well? I want to thank our panelists for a lively discussion, and thank all of you for being an attentive audience, and enjoy your few minutes off.